All right, guys. So in this project, we're going to be interacting with the Giphy API. And this project is going to be fairly similar to the Pexels project, but there's going to be some minor differences. We will be receiving a whole bunch of images from the Giphy API, just like we did from the Pexels API, and then rendering it out onto the screen. However, there are a few extra features that we're going to be implementing in this application that we didn't do in our Pexels application. And the first feature is going to be pagination. So we're going to be retrieving either a predefined or a random number of GIFs from the Giphy API. And based off of the number of GIFs that we want to load per page, we should automatically calculate how many pages we need. And then we should be able to go through the different pages to see the different content. So that's the first functionality that we're going to be adding in. And another one that we're going to be adding in is a little bit harder to show, but it's going to be the loading functionality. Because we are interacting with a remote server, it takes a certain amount of time to retrieve that data back from that server. And it's good practice to provide some kind of indicator to the user that we're actively loading content onto the screen. And so I just set up a simple spinner, and if I hit the reload, I think you should be able to see it for a split second. So if I do refresh, you saw that little blue spinner. Let me do it one more time. Yep, there's that little blue spinner that's going to be spinning whenever we're loading GIFs. All right, so that's the two main differences. Outside of that, it's pretty similar to what we did with the Pexels API. And hopefully with the extra features we're adding onto this website, we can continue to build out our skill set and make some real world applications. All right, so I think that's enough talking. I'll see you guys in the next video. The first thing that we have to do is set up an account on Giphy so that we can make use of their API. So we need to get a authentication token, which we can send in our requests so that we can authenticate with their API. Now, if you don't already have a Giphy account, go ahead and go to developers.giphy.com and then hit the Get Started button. And then from here, you want to select Login at the top. It's going to take you to a login page. If you have a login already, go ahead and enter it in. If you don't, just select Join Giphy and then fill out this information, and then it'll redirect you to your dashboard. So I'm going to log in because I already have an account. Now your dashboard should look relatively similar to mine, except you won't have this app that I created already. So let me walk you through how to create a new app. So select Create an App. Give it a name. So I'm just going to call this React Project 2. And then we'll say Practicing React. And then you have an option of selecting the Giphy SDK and or the Giphy API. We're just going to make use of the Giphy API. So just select the bottom one and then hit Create New App. And so we've got this second app right here that I created. And you should only have one, but just copy the API key in there. So if you just select it, that will copy that. And then store that someplace safe so that when we actually set up Axios, we can add this into the parameters. All right, so now that we've got the API set up, let's start our project. So I'm going to go to our terminal. And I'm going to do Create React App, and we'll call this app Giphy. Okay, so now that that's finished, we will move into our newly created Giphy directory. And then I'm going to open this up in VS Code. And as usual, we're going to go into our source directory and we're going to delete everything. And then let's create a new file called index.js. Now, before proceeding any further, we will need to import two different libraries into our project. Well, actually 3. So we're going to need Bootstrap. We're going to need Font Awesome Icons. And we're going to also need to import Axios. So let's get those 3 imported. So let's go to getbootstrap.com and then select documentation and then find the CSS section and copy that. And so we'll go into our index.html. And we'll paste that in there. And then we also want to go to cdnjs.com. And then in here, I want you to just search for Font Awesome. And the first result should be the one you want. So just hit the copy button. And then we're just going to add another link tag. And then lastly, let's go to our terminal and we're going to import Axios. All right, and then in our index.js file, we're going to do the usual import React, as well as import React DOM. And now here, we're going to make a slight modification to how we set up our application, because normally we would define our app component, right? And then we would call React DOM .render, right? And then, render out the app component to that root ID. So the difference is that instead of defining our app component within our index.js, I'm going to move it into its own separate file. I think it's a little cleaner and neater to have your app logic in a separate folder and then keep the index.js file as lean as possible. And you'll see that this is what most people do anyways. So moving forward in this project, as well as all future projects, this is how we're going to actually set it up. So let's delete this. I'm going to create a new file. We'll call this app.jsx. Within there, we need to import React. And then let's define our component. So app. And everything else is pretty much the same. We don't really have to change anything else. And then we'll just return a div that says app. And then we want to make sure we export it. And then in our index.js file, we'll do an import app from /app. And then as usual, we'll call React DOM.render. We'll render our app component. And then we'll get document.get element by ID. It's going to be root. So pretty much everything else is exactly the same. We just moved app into its own separate file. So we'll save all. We'll do an npm start. Close out some unneeded tabs. Okay, so our project has been set up. I think this is a good stopping point for now. In the next video, we'll get started actually building out the logic for our Giphy application. Now for our Giphy application, let's define a new component. So I'm going to make a new folder called components. And then within here, I'm going to make a new component called, we'll just call it Giphy. And then once we've got that set up, we'll go back to our app component. We'll import it into there. Whoops, that's what I want, but I'm supposed to make this Giphy. And then we'll render out our GIF component. So it's going to be Giphy. Save all, and it should say Giphy. Okay, so we've got our Giphy component loaded up. Now, let's take a look at what we need to do within our Giphy component. We know we're going to have to make an API call to, the Giphy.com API to get some data. And the way that the application works is actually, let me pull up the application real quick so we can take a look at it. All right, so this is our final application. And so if you take a look at it, when we load up the app, you'll see that we retrieve some GIFs and show that on the screen. And you'll see that the GIFs that we want to retrieve when it first loads up are the trending GIFs. And we're also going to have a input search box so that we can search for specific GIFs. And then on top of that, we also have a pagination section. So in this case, I think we're getting 100 posts and we're going to show 25 posts per page. So we've got 4 different pages and we can select that and hop through that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make an API call to receive all the trending GIFs so that we can render it onto the screen. So let's see how we can do that. The easiest way is to go to the Giphy developers page, and we need to go to their docs. And then within here, we want to go to their API endpoints and then just select trending. And if we take a look at how the trending endpoints set up, we have to make a call to this URL, and we have to pass in a certain number of parameters. So the first one is the API key. And if you don't remember what a parameter is, remember that's the part of the URL at the end where you have a question mark, and then you have, some kind of key value pair. So we're going to first pass in the API key. So that's how they're going to authenticate us. And that's a little different from our previous Pexel API because authentication there, we had to use the authorization header. But here they're just doing it through the URL parameter. So obviously there's a number of different ways you can set up your backend. This is how they chose to do it. It only requires a minor modification on our end. So it should be fairly straightforward once I show you guys how to do that. There's a couple of other optional parameters that we can set. So we can set a limit to the number of GIFs that we want. The default is 25, which I think is fine for now. But if we wanted like 100 GIFs, we could type in 100. You can also do an offset. So if you did an offset of 5, it would skip the first 5 GIFs that it normally would send and starts at number 6. And then it looks like you can filter based off of ratings and a few other things, but that's not really important. So let's make our first API call when the component loads. And so the way to do that is using the use effect hook. So we'll do use effect. And I already know we're going to need the use state hook. So let's add that in there as well. And we'll just do use effect, pass an arrow function. And then within here, when you want to make an API call, you remember that we have to define a separate function to make that call in. Because if we just did it within the use effect hook, it could potentially cause the use effect to return a promise, which it should not do. So let's do const fetch data like we always do. And this is going to be an async function. And then here we want to make our Axios call, but we have to actually import Axios first. So import Axios from Axios. And the URL is going to be https:// and then copy this trending endpoint. And then the second parameter into our call should be an object. And then here we want to set the parameters. The first parameter is going to be the API underscore key. And this is going to be set to the API key that you got from your developer dashboard. And that should be the only parameter we need to pass in. We can keep everything to the default. Then after that, we want to call this function. So we need to do fetch data. And then within fetch data at the end, first of all, we need to make sure we store the results of our API call. So we'll do const results equals Axios. And remember, this is an asynchronous call, so we have to do await. And then we want to console.log results just to see what that data looks like. Hit save. Let's go to our React application, go to the developer console. And it looks like we've got our data back. So within our results object, we have a couple of different properties. So we've got the data property, and that's going to be all of the actual data from the API. And then we got a few other properties that are set by Axios, but we don't care about that. So let's go to our data property. And then within our data property, we've got another data property, and that's going to be the 25 GIFs that we requested. We also have some information regarding pagination. So it's going to let us know that there's 119,350 total GIFs, and we requested for 25, and there's an offset of 0. So we're getting the first 25. If this said 25, that would mean we're getting 26 through 50 instead of 0 through 25. Okay, so now that we got our data, it just makes sense to store it into our state like we normally do. So we'll do const Then for the state, we could call this GIFs, but I'm thinking I'm just going to call it data for now. So data, set data equals use state. And then we're going to pass in a default of an empty array. And we will set data to results. And then this is where it gets a little tricky because remember, we want the data, but then we also want the next data. So we want results dot data dot data. Let's hit save. Oh, dope. How do I cancel that? You can see it's stuck in a loop. We don't want to do that. So let's close that out for a sec. And if you recall, we made a mistake in our API call or in our use effect hook. Because I didn't pass the empty dependency array, this is going to result in a loop. So we want to pass in that empty dependency array. I'm going to save that and then we'll start it again. All right, it's loaded back up. We can go back to inspect and we're still looping. Did I not save it? Oh, I messed up. I put the dependency array in the wrong place. I need it here. I put it at the, where did I put it? I put it in the wrong section at first. So you want to make sure you put it in here, right at the, as the second parameter to use effect. Okay. And then after we did that, we can see we get just one API call like it should. And if we go to our components, we can verify that the state got set accordingly. So if we go to the Giphy component and then go to our state, you can see that we've got the 25 different GIFs that we have requested. Great. So I think this is a good stopping point. In the next video, we will tackle how to handle loading. And that's one of the new things I wanted to introduce in this project. All right, guys. So in this video, we're going to first render out the data, as in we're going to render out the GIFs that we have fetched. And then after that, we're going to tackle how to set up a loading icon so that when we're in the process of fetching the data, we can provide some feedback to the user, letting him know that we are actively loading the data. And then once we have gotten our data, we should then get rid of the loading icon and then show them the actual GIFs. So to render out the data, we want to go to our return statement. Right now, I'm just returning a div that says Giphy. We're going to remove that, and I'm going to pass in a function that's going to be called render GIF. Render GIFs. And I'm going to give it a few classes. So this will be container and GIFs. And let's define that render GIF function. And here we'll just do a return, and then we'll return data dot map el, and then here we will return some divs. So we'll do div and then within this div we'll return a GIF or an image. Sorry, we'll pass an image tag, and the source, we got to figure out what the source is going to be. So let's go back to our data and go to data, and let's take a look at one of these GIFs. So we probably want, within that GIF, we probably want the images property. And then we'll get fixed height. So let's see, there should be something called fixed height right here. And then we want URL. So we want data. So we want images, fixed height, and then URL. So I'm going to put in images. It's going to be, el.images.fixed_height.url. And you're going to see that I get this warning because I haven't passed an alt prop, but who cares about that? And then another thing we can do is, because we actually receive this data from an API, you'll see that we now have an ID property for each GIF. So we can we can retrieve the ID property and then pass that as a key, so we get rid of that annoying React warning. So we can do key equals el.id. And so that should be it. I think if we hit run, we've got our GIFs. Now, there's one thing I forgot to do in the previous video, and we need to add some custom CSS to make this look a little nicer. So we will do inside source, we'll do file, and then we'll do app.css. And we're going to copy just a few lines of CSS into here. And so this is all the CSS that we need. I'm not going to write it out line by line. So pause the video and just go ahead and copy it, or you can download the final code files for this project if you go to my online course, which is once again completely free. So check that out, download the files, and then you can just copy and paste it. But in this case, it's only 4 different. I just have 4 different styles, so you can just write it out yourself. So if we do a save all, I think things should look a little nicer. And let's refresh this. Yep, that didn't work, and that's because I actually didn't import my CSS file. So go into your app.jsx and do import app.css. Read /app.css. There we go. So now we got that nice dark background. We've got a little bit of a grid system so that we can show multiple GIFs on one line. And it looks overall pretty nice. So we've got the first step in place of retrieving the data and rendering out that data. Now we need to implement the loading function. So basically, when we're fetching the data, we should see a little spinner come up on the screen saying it's loading. And then once that data comes in, we got to get rid of the spinner and then show the actual data. So let's logically think about how we can implement this, right? Because we're obviously going to need a new state variable to represent, when the application is actively loading and when the application isn't loading. So clearly, the first thing we need to do is let's implement a new state. So we'll call this is loading. So it's going to be a Boolean, and then set is loading, and then use state. The default for our application should be it's not actively loading anything. So let's think about when we would want to change the state of our application to is loading to true. Well, once we go inside our fetch data function, right? As soon as we go in there, it means that we're trying to fetch data. So I think right here we should do set is loading and set that to true, right? So if I hit save, well, nothing should happen right now because we haven't put in any logic. But let's put in some logic for the is loading. So if we go under render GIFs, we'll first say if is loading is true, I'm going to return loading. I'm going to return a div that just says loading. Loading. ... And why is this throwing an error? Did I spell that wrong? Is loading is not defined. Oh, I forgot to capitalize this L. Okay, so basically, if the loading state is set to true, we're going to return just a simple div that says loading. If it's false, then we're going to render out all of our GIFs. So let's hit save. And you can see nothing is showing up on the screen. If we do an inspect, go to the body, div. Eventually, you'll see the div that just says loading. So it did work, our loading feature, except the characters are in black, so we don't see it. But you can see that now that it's highlighted, it is in fact there. But what I want to do now is I want to actually create a separate loading component that's going to show a loading spinner, because I think that's a little more, a little prettier to the eyes versus just saying the words loading. So under components, we're going to define a new file. We'll call this loader. You can call it loading, whatever you want to call it. We want to import React. And then here we're just going to return, we'll return a div with the class name of loader. And then here we're going to return a font awesome icon. All right, so this is going to give us a loading spinner. And if you guys aren't very comfortable with Font Awesome, just go to the Font Awesome documentation. And then here, just search for, I think it's called Spinner. And so this is the one I got. So if you click on Spinner right here, and then select Start using this icon, you'll see you want to pass in an I tag with a class of FAS, which I have, and then FA Spinner. So that's going to be the first two. And then FA4X just makes it significantly bigger. So I think it's like 4 times the size. And then FA Spin is what's going to allow it to actually be spinning. So we get that nice animation. So we'll save that. We need to export this component. And then let's import it into Giphy. So we'll do import loader from /loader. And then where we render this return statement, this is going to be our loader component. So we'll do loader. Actually, we won't need the outside div either. Now if we hit save, save all. There we go. So we got our spinning loader. So we are presenting some feedback to the user that we are fetching data, but you'll see that it's just stuck like this, right? And I think you guys probably already know the reason why we don't see the actual data, because if we go to our console, we have actually retrieved the data and it's complete, right? And the reason why it's still showing the loader is because we haven't set the actual state for is loading to false, right? To basically let the application know that, we are no longer in a loading state. So we need to find some place to actually set this to false. And let's think about where that would be, right? When would we say that it's, that we've finished making our API call and have retrieved the data and saved the data? Well, I think it makes sense to set it right beneath set data, right? Because once we set the data to the retrieved data, we have finished our API call. We're done. So we can do set is loading to false. And so basically what's going to happen is we're going to go into our use effect hook once the component mounts. We'll call the fetch data. And before we even fetch the data, we'll set is loading to true, which means that we're going to render out this loading spinner. We'll fetch the data. We'll save the data. And then we'll set the loading as to false. And because remember, this is a state object, anytime state changes, we have to re-render the component. So when we re-render it with the loading as false, we call the render GIFs again, except this time it is loading is false. So we never run this if statement and we just render out the data. So let's hit save and you'll see that we render out the data. But the thing about this is that I couldn't exactly see the loading spinner because it looks like we're able to retrieve the data very quickly. So if you want to test to see if the loading spinner is actually truly working in this case, what I would do is I would set the limit and just set it to 1,000 real quick. So that's going to retrieve 1,000 GIFs. And just keep your eye out on here. Let me minimize this a little bit so we can see that. Hit save. And you can see the loading spinner. And then we retrieve the data. So it's working fine. Go ahead and remove limit for now. We're just going to keep it at 25. All right, so we've got the loading functionality in place. That was one of the things I really wanted to highlight in this video. In the next video, we're going to tackle how to handle errors. And when I say errors, I mean if for some reason we aren't able to retrieve the data for some reason, we need to be able to provide some feedback to the user to let them know that, hey, we had trouble retrieving the data. Either hit refresh or retry again in a few minutes or something of that nature. So we'll get to that in the next video. Hopefully you guys learned a lot in this video and I'll see you guys there. Okay, guys, in this video, we're going to handle error management. And basically, the idea is anytime there's any kind of error when it comes to retrieving the data, either if we can't reach the API server or, for some other reason, if we lose network connectivity, we want to make sure that we let the user know that there was some kind of error and we were unable to fetch the data, and then give them some kind of instruction of either, maybe reload the page or try again in a few seconds. And to handle that, or to actually put in the logic for that, most likely we'll need another state object, right? Just like we did with is loading, we may want to have an is error state to basically, identify when there is an error and when there isn't an error in our application, so that we can render out different components. So let's add that in there. So we'll do const is error, and we'll do set is error, and then use state. And by default, it makes sense to start our application with no errors. Too many states. All right, use state. Okay, and so when we try to fetch the data, and what I want to do is when we're fetching our data, and before we do anything, just in case our is error boolean got set to true during some other portion of our application, I want to make sure I set it back to false before we make our API call. So we'll do set is error, and we want to set it to false because we're going to assume there's no errors until an actual error occurs. And what we're going to do here is we're going to wrap our API call in a try catch statement. So we're going to do try and then catch. And we can pass in the error object into our catch statement. And now basically how the try catch block works is that we will try to run some commands within the try block. And if everything works okay, everything will run in there, and then we'll exit out of it. But if one of the commands or one of the lines of code throws an error, we'll run into the catch block where we'll catch the error, and then we can perform different actions when an error occurs. So this is how we handle errors within JavaScript. So I'm going to take our API call right here, and I'm going to move that into our try block. So we're going to try to, fetch this data and store it into results. And we'll also want to move the console.log as well as the set data. So we're going to perform all of this within the try block. And if for some reason we get any kind of error, we will, go into our catch statement and we'll perform a different set of actions. So if there's an error, we're going to obviously set is error to true. And just to see what the error is, we can do a console.log and we can print out the error object. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. This is just plain JavaScript. This is nothing specific to React. But let's run our application. And, there's going to be no changes in our application because there's no errors. So the easiest way to kind of force an error in our application is just to mistype the URL. I'm just going to put a 4 right here. So if I hit save, we print nothing to our screen. You see we get this error right here, error network error. Okay, so it looks like there was an error that occurred, which means we hit the catch block and then we set is error to true. And we can verify that that's the case by going into components, and we go to Giphy and we can see the state is set to true. Okay. And then we printed out the actual error. Now we need to actually make the UI do something different when an error occurs. So what I was thinking is I was looking at the Bootstrap documentation. So if I go back to get Bootstrap and then go to documentations, they've got a CSS component for exactly what I want to do. And I'm trying to remember what it was. Whoops, it's alerts right here. So I'm sure you've seen an application that kind of spits out an alert. And usually it's in red when there's an error, but they've got different colors. And so I'm going to use this alert right here. And so the code for that is just alert. And then we want alert dash danger to make it red. Okay. And so let's go ahead and implement that logic. So under I'm actually going to go into this return statement right here. And I'm going to add some spaces. And then we're going to put parentheses. And that should be, there we go. And I'm going to add another div. So we'll do div class name equals m-2. I'm going to close off that div, and then we want to move the closing tag of that div at the bottom. And then within here, we're going to render our error. So we'll do render error. And we're going to define this function now. So we'll call this const render error. And basically, we're just going to do a simple if statement to check if error is set to true. And if it is, we want to perform some kind of action. So we'll do return. And then I'm going to do a div with a class of alert, alert dash warning, alert dash dismissible. I think I spelled that right. And then, whoops, there should be alert, alert dash warning, alert dash dismissible, and then fade as well as show. And then I'm also going to add a role equals alert. And then within this div, we're going to pass in some text. So I'm just going to say unable to get GIFs. Please try again in a few minutes. And then beneath that, we want to throw in a button. And I'm going to add a class of close. Actually, let's remove the button for now. Let's just see what this looks like. So if I hit save and take a look at our React app, you can see that we have unable to get GIFs. Please try again in a few minutes. And that's because, if you remember, I still have that 4 within our URL, so it's going to force an error. And actually, I don't like that color. I'm going to change this to alert-primary. Or sorry, not primary, danger. Yeah, there you go. That really lets the user know they did something wrong. Okay, and this looks okay. The only problem is it's just stuck there, right? And usually with alerts, I want them to kind of go away after a few seconds. And so let's implement the logic for that. So what we can do is we can use the set timeout function. So if I go under here, under the catch statement, we don't need this console.log. We can do set timeout and then pass an arrow function. And basically we want to set is error back to false. And whenever that occurs, that's going to trigger a re-render, and then it'll re-render our UI, and then it'll call this render error function. And because is error is set to false, we won't render out this component right here. So if I hit save, actually we need to add one more thing. Basically with the timeout, the second parameter I have to pass in is how long it should wait. So I'm going to do 4 seconds. And so all this is doing is that after we set error to true, set timeout will run and it'll wait 4 seconds. And then after 4 seconds, it will set is error to false. So if I hit save, we reload, we get this error. And then if we give it a few more seconds, you'll see that the error disappears. And that's exactly what we want our application to do. All right, so we have successfully implemented our error handling logic in our application. In the next video, we're going to work on implementing the code so that the user can search for specific GIFs. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and implement the search functionality. And the first thing that we have to do is basically render out a form for the user to fill out so that they can submit a search. So here under render error, I'm going to define a form. We'll do form class name equals form-inline justify-content-center m-2. And then within that form, we're going to have our input element. So the input type equals text, placeholder equals search. I forgot to close this out. And then class is going to be set to form-control. And then on change equals search change. Value equals search. And then we can close out that tag. Actually, sorry guys, I don't know why I put this in here yet. This is something we're going to implement in a second. So we'll just delete that for now, and then we'll set up the controlled logic in a second. So then after this, we want to add in the buttons. So we'll do button, and this is going to be type equals submit. And then classes are going to be btn and btn-primary. And maybe we want an mx-2. And we'll say it just says go. Okay, so we've got our form, and let me fix this right here. Okay, so we've got our search form. Now let's make this a controlled form or a controlled input. So as usual, we're going to go up here, and I'm going to define const search, set search, and then use state. And then we're going to set a on change event handler equals on, we'll call this handle search change. We'll do set search to, and remember we got to pass in event, and we'll do event.target.value. And then here we also want to set the value to search. Okay, so it should now be a controlled input. So if I type in something, and then if we take a look at the API, the React Dev Tools, you can see the state right here where it's setting everything I've typed into the state. Okay, so it is now a controlled input. And now let's actually set up the logic to handle us hitting go. So on this button, we're going to do on click equals handle. We'll just say handle submit. So we'll do const handle submit equals event. And then here, once we hit submit, we have to handle the logic of actually making that API call to the Giphy API with our specific search query. And so what we're going to do is it's going to look very similar to what we have in useEffect. We're just going to modify the Axios call so that instead of the API going to trending, it's going to go to search. And if you go back to the documents for the Giphy API, if you go to search, there we go. So you can see that the URL for the search is pretty much the same, except it ends in search instead of trending. So that's the only thing we have to change. But we do have to pass in one more parameter. So that's going to be called Q. And that's going to be the string that represents what we want to search for. So let's handle the logic for that. So it's going to be const fetch data. And this is going to be const results equals await. And that's going to be Axios HTTPS : and then we just copy that in there. And then we need to pass in our object. There's going to be params. And then within here, we want API underscore key. And I'm just going to copy what I had set up here. And then beneath that, we have to do Q. And we have to figure out how to actually get the search value. And since this is a controlled input, right? This is a controlled input. We already have the value of our search input within search. So we just have to pass in search down here. And because we're using await, this has to be an async function. Actually, I made a mistake. We don't actually need the fetch data function anymore because we're not within useEffect. So we can remove that altogether and just make the API call directly within handle submit. And it looks like we got an error. So can I use it outside of an async function? Yep. So if we have to move the async to there. And so now it's going to search that. So if we do search or save, and then type in a search, we'll say pizza. Nothing changed. And that's because we actually need to make sure we do a couple of things. So first of all, so anytime we submit a form, the default behavior is to reload the page, and we never want to do that. So we want to do event.prevent default. And then we also want to implement all of the loading and error functionality within this function as well. Because when we perform an API call for the search API, everything should behave the same way. So we want to set error to false as well as set loading to true. And I also want to, after we make the API call, we need to set data, right? So we'll do the same thing. And then after that, we need to set loading back to false. All right, let's save that. And let's take a look. Let's see if we can search for, let's say, falling. All right, and now we've got GIFs of people falling. Perfect. And let's make sure our loading and our error logic works. So I'm going to set this to a limit of 1,000. And we should see, we saw the loading icon. Well, that wasn't for the search. We have to actually search for something. So we'll do pizza and we get the loading icon. Okay, so that works. However, there's one thing that's missing. If I try to add a for to this API call under the handle submit, hit save, and then I type in pizza again, you'll see that we're just stuck in spinning, right? And that's because we errored out. And if you look at the code up here, we did the try catch block. However, we don't have the try catch block here, so we have to implement that within here as well, because it's really the same exact code. There's nothing different. We're making an API call, we're handling the loading logic, and we're handling the error logic, so everything really should be the same. So we'll take this, and we're going to move that up to here. And we'll move set data up here. Well, actually, it's going to go right down here. And if there's an error, we want to make sure that we handle that. So let's take a look at our code up here. How did we handle the error? So we do set is error, and then we also want that timeout as well. And then at the bottom of this, we're going to set is loading to false as usual. So let's hit save. Let's search for pizza. And this is perfect. So we got the error, and it went away after 4 seconds. Okay, so we've got our search functionality in place. The last thing I want to do for this project And let's test this one more time. So we'll do noodles. And let's fix the URL just to make sure everything works. And so we'll do noodles. Great, that works. And then let's change the URL back to a broken link just to double check. We'll do noodles and perfect. All right, so we've got the error handling functionality implemented into our application. However, there's one issue. Let's say that we want to basically show 1,000 GIFs, like I said here, right? So if I go back to this, our first API call for the trending and do limit 1,000, you can see that our web page is massive, right? It's got to load all of these GIFs. It takes a lot of time. It's still loading. Look at that. And so I don't like this. Normally in an application, when you're loading this much data, you want to perform some kind of pagination so the user can only see a certain subset of this, a certain subset of your data. And if they want to see more, they'll have to either click the next button or hit the next page. And if we take a look at the completed application, you'll see that I've got some pagination set up so that we have all the GIFs broken down into pages. And so I want to implement that logic, and we'll tackle that in the next video. All right, guys, so we're going to implement the pagination functionality now, and that's going to wrap up this project. And you'll see that the pagination functionality is a little bit difficult at first because there's a lot of logic that goes into it. But once you have it, or once you've done it once or twice, you'll see that you pretty much can just reuse this code for all of your projects. Now let's actually break down the logic behind how this pagination works. And to do that, I'm going to first change our limit back to 100 just to make our math a little easier. And I'm going to do that here as well. And I'm going to save that, let it run again. And let's take a look at exactly what's going to happen. So we've got 1,000 GIFs, sorry, 100 GIFs that loads up, right? And we need to determine how many GIFs we want to load on a per page basis. So there's going to be, so let's say that we want 25 GIFs per page because that feels like an adequate number. So the two things that we need to do is we need to keep state on what page we're on, right? And we'll also have to keep state on how many GIFs we want per page. So let's implement that state first before we move on to anything else. We'll do const. We'll call this current page. So this is going to represent what page we're on. And then we want set current page. And this is going to be, we're going to default to page 1. That makes sense. And then we also want items per page. And you'll see that I'm going to use the word items instead of GIFs so that this this code can be used for other projects and you won't have to worry about renaming things. And I'm going to set this to 25. Now, technically, we don't actually have to store this as state. I could just store this as like a reference variable or something. But if you ever wanted to implement a feature in your application where the user can select how many items they want on a per page basis, then you would want to store that in a state so that you can trigger a re-render of your object or of your application. Okay, so we know, we basically will know what page we're on and how many items we want per page, but there's two other details that we have to calculate. We need to find the index of the first item that we're going to have and the index of the last item. So if we're on page 1, right, you have to think about what is the index of the first item. The first item is going to be item. Let me do this as comments. It's going to be item 1, right? And then the last item is going to be item 25, right? Because we want 25 items per page and we're on page 1, so that's going to be item 1 through 25. And this is going to be page 1. And then let's take a look at page 2. And page 2 is going to start on item 26, right? So wherever page 1 left off. And then it's going to go through item 50. And then page 3 is going to start on item 51 and go through item 75. Okay, and so you see how that goes. So basically, to figure out the last item, all we have to do is we have to take the page number and then multiply it by the items per page, right? So if we're on page 3 and we have 25 items per page, that's going to give us 75, which is the last item. So we can do, and I'm not going to store this in a variable, in a state variable. It's just going to be a plain variable. So I'll just do const index of last item equals current page times items per page. Okay, so that's going to give us that last item. And then if we want the first item within a page, we basically take the last item and then we subtract it by 25 or by items per page. So if we want what this first item is here, we just do the last item, which we already calculated, and then we subtract items per page. So minus 25, it's going to give us 51. Right? And then if we go to page 2, we do the same thing. So just subtract 25, and then we get 26. So we'll define that here. So we'll do const index of first item, which equals index of last item minus items per page. And you may be wondering, well, why are we getting these indexes of, what's the first item within a page and the last item within a page? Well, we're ultimately going to slice our data array so that we only retrieve the items between these two numbers. So between the first item and the last item, because that's all we want to render out to a specific page. So now that we have this logic, what we want to do is let's create a custom pagination component. So I'll do new file, and I'll just call this paginate.jsx. And then within here, we'll import React, and then we'll do const paginate return div, and then we'll do export default paginate. And let's load our paginate object within our Giphy component. So the best place to do that, I think, would be at the top. So if you look at our application, the completed one, you'll see we have in the top right corner underneath the search bar. So let's go to this div right here. Under the form, so right after this form, we'll put in another div. Actually, we won't even need to wrap it in a div. We can just put in the paginate component. Paginate. And then we have to actually import it first. We'll do import paginate from /paginate. And let's just put in where it's paginate. Save all. I don't see anything rendered to the screen, but that's just because the text is black. So it's somewhere in there. Don't worry about that though. Now there's some data that we need to pass into our paginate component. And so we're going to pass it down as props. So let's go down to our paginate component. The first thing is we want that current page, which is going to be equal to our state called current page. We need to pass in items per page, which equals items per page. And then lastly, we need to pass in the total number of items. So that's going to be total items. And to get the total items, it's nothing more than getting the length of our data array. So this equals data.length. And now let's take those props and let's implement our pagination functionality. So we'll pass in props. And we're going to start off by defining an empty array called page numbers. And what we want to do with this array is we want this array to contain an incrementing set of numbers from page 1 to the total number of pages we want. So if we have 10 pages, this array should be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? And if we want, 12 pages, then it should be this. So we have to figure out how to do that. And the way to do that is we're going to do a for loop. And we want let I equals 1. We're going to start it at 1. And then when I is less than or equal to, and this is where it's going to get a little confusing, but we'll do props dot total items, right? So this is going to be the size of our entire array, right? The data array. So this is going to be, if we're retrieving 100 objects or 100 GIFs, then the total items is going to be a length. The total items is going to be equal to 100. And then we want to divide it by items per page. However, there's one issue. Let's say we get 101 GIFs, right? So what's 101 divided by 25? Then that means it's going to be, we want 4.1 pages. And what do we do with the 0.1 page, right? So we want to round up. So if we have 101 GIFs, instead of 4 pages, we want 5 total pages, right? You always want to round up. So to round up, we'll just wrap this in parentheses, and then we'll call the math.ceiling function, which will round up. And then finally, we want to I++. So that's how you set up a for loop. And this should be actually props.items per page. And then what we want to do is we want to do page number dot push I. All right. So if you guys aren't familiar with for loops, let me kind of take you through it step by step. So in the first iteration, I is going to start at set to a value of 1. And so if I is less than math.ceiling props.total items divided by props.items per page. So this is going to be 100 here, total items divided by items per page, which is 25. So this is going to be 4. So if I is less than 4, which is true, we're going to run this code. So we're going to push I into our array. So we're going to add 1, right? Then once we finish that, we then increment I by 1. So now I equals 2. Is 2 less than 4? Yes. We're going to push 2 into the array. Then we go to 3. Is 3 less than 4? Yep. Okay, we're going to add that. And is 4 less than or equal to 4? Yep. So we're going to push that. Then we're going to add 1. Then it goes to 5. 5 is not less than or equal to 4. So then we break out of this loop. All right, so that's all we're doing here. Now we actually want to render out our buttons. Okay, so let's remove this paginate right here. And I'm actually going to change this to a nav. And we want to render out a UL with classes of pagination, and then pagination-sm, and then justify-content-end, and then border-0. And then here we want to loop or iterate through this array and generate LIs with the number of each element. So this will be button for page 1. This will be the button for page 2. This will be the button for page 3, and so on. And also we want to make sure we don't hard code any values. And so we will iterate through that using page numbers.map number. Should be page number. Well, actually this should be numbers. Numbers. So number. And we want to return the following JSX. So we'll do li dot page dash item. What is happening? So li dot, and then within that li, we want an anchor tag. The href it's just going to be a dummy link for now. And then we're going to put a class name of page-link. And the value of this anchor tag is going to be set to the item that we're iterating over. So number. All right, and I think that should be it. So let's save that. And let's take a look. So it looks like we've rendered out this component, but I don't see anything in there. So we may have done something wrong. So let me take a look and see what I did wrong. Okay, yep, it looks like I just forgot to hit save all. But now we have our 4 buttons. If we click on it, it does, well, it reloads the page, which is not what we want to do. But outside of that, these buttons don't do anything. Okay, so we've got our buttons rendered out, and let's make sure that this code actually works if we change the number of items per page. So if I go back to Giphy and change this to, let's say I want 5 items per page, which means we should have 20 total pages for 100 GIFs. You can see that we've got 1 through 20. That's perfect. So I'm going to change this back to 25 for now. And you can double check, but it looks like, so there's a couple issues. We were able to render out the buttons. However, we weren't able to actually render out just 25 GIFs. So we actually have to put in the logic to handle that. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to make it so that we update the current page when a button is selected. Okay. And to do that, we have to pass an event handler down to our pagination object. So we'll define a function. We'll call this page selected. I think that's a good name. We'll say const page selected equals. And all we want to do is, first of all, we want to make sure the page number is passed in. And then we just want to set current page to page number. It's as simple as that. And then we want to pass this function down as a prop towards paginate. So we'll say set page or set current page equals set. Sorry, not set current page. I want page selected. Then we want to go back to paginate. And then what we want to do is we want to put an on-click event handler on the A tag. So we'll do on click. And we'll just say this function is going to return props dot page selected. And then we want to pass in the page that was selected. So this is going to be number. All right, because the number is going to represent which item in the page numbers array we're iterating over. Let's hit save. And I want to go back. Actually, let's do a save all and let's test our code. All right, so we've got our 4 pages. So our pagination is working so far. And I want to make sure we verify that our state gets updated properly. So if we go to Giphy, I believe this 1 right here is going to represent what page we are currently selected. So if I select page 2, we can see that the state updated to 2. So the logic is working. If I hit 3, 3, 4, back to 1, perfect. Okay. Now we actually have to implement showing the GIFs that represent that page. And so what we want to do is let's go back to Giphy. And you'll see that if we go to where we render the GIFs, all we're doing is, if we go to render GIFs, where is it? Where is it? So much code. This is getting out of hand, man. Here we go. Render GIFs. We're basically iterating over the entire data array and then rendering out a div with an image. So we take all 100 GIFs and we're going to render a separate div for that. But now, since we have pagination in place, what we want to do is we want to just render out a certain subset of this array. And we have to figure out what is that subset, and we can do that by making a simple calculation. So if I create a new variable, I'll call this const current items, we can say data.slice, and then index of first item, and then index of last item. So let's take a look at what this is doing. We know what the index of the first item is of a specific page that we're on, right? And then we know what the index of the last item is for a specific page that we're on. And with those two things, we're going to go to this array and we're going to slice it so we grab all the GIFs from the first item to the last item, and then we essentially just delete the rest. Well, we're not deleting the rest. We're storing this in a separate array. So we're never modifying our state. The state is going to always store 100 GIFs. But we're going to store this in another variable. And then what we can do is when we render this out, we can say current items.map. So we're only going to map the items associated with the specific page that we're on. And so if we hit save, and now if I hit 2, you can see we load up the next 25 GIFs. If I hit 3, the next 25 GIFs, and then 4, the next 25 GIFs. Okay, and so you can see our pagination is working great now. The only thing that I see that's not right is that, we need some kind of indicator on whether or not, basically an indicator on what page we're on. So the user knows what page he's on, so then he can go to other pages. Because if we're on 3, there's no way for us to know that we're on 3. And then if we just select it, we'll be like, well, why isn't anything happening? So let's implement that. And to actually show that, if you go to the Bootstrap documentation, and I think if you go to pagination, if you scroll down, you'll see that there's a active state. So if you put in a class for a specific LI, and you pass in the extra active tag, it's going to turn that nice and blue so the user knows that he is on that specific page. So let's implement that logic now. If we go to paginate, we know basically when we pass the data down to the paginate object, we know what current page we're on because we pass it down as a prop. So if we go to paginate, and then basically we're going to define a new function. We'll call this, actually, we won't need to define a new function. Instead, what I want to do is within here, I can just put in an if statement. And for the classes right here, for this li, I'm going to remove this. And I'm going to pass in classes. So this is going to be a variable that we're going to define up here. So we'll say classes equals, const classes equals, what was it? Page-item, I think. Hopefully it's page-item. So this is the one that's always going to be there, whether the link is whether the page number is active or not. And then basically what we want to do is if number equals the props.current page, what I want to do is I want to do classes plus equals active. So we'll add the active class to highlight it blue. And then when we iterate through our array and then render this out, you'll see that we will add the classes array that we've returned. And so if the page isn't selected, we'll just return page-item. But if it is selected, we'll do page-item plus active. So let me hit save. Oh, I got an error because I clearly messed up something. Well, this should be a let because we're modifying it. All right, so 1 is highlighted. If I select 3, 3 is highlighted, 4 is highlighted. All right, so we've got pagination in place. All right, so I think our application is complete. I think this was probably the most advanced project we've done so far. We added a lot of great and common features that most websites have these days. However, the code isn't actually 100% perfect. You'll see that especially within the Giphy component, there's a lot of code that's repeated, especially when it comes to fetching data, because you can see we're fetching the data within the use effect. as well as the handle submit. So this is something we could break out into a separate function. However, I think this video is I think this project has gone on for long enough, and I want to make sure that we kind of focus on the core concepts of React. So, refactoring this to make it a little more efficient isn't really going to teach you guys too much. So for now, I think we're going to wrap up this project, and then we'll start learning some new topics in the next section.